Thank you for coming out tonight. Wow, some old friends. And I'm opening this in part because I'm actually thrilled that Eric was willing to have a little talk about my book. But we had talked about this a couple months ago, and in a certain sense, a few years ago. And I was really eager to pick up a conversation that Eric and I had started a few years ago when we did an installation in the gallery that also had to do with this book. And in fact, Corrections and Collections, Architectures for Art and Crime, has a long and, am I doing okay here? A long and storied career, or it's come of age as I have through SCI-Arc as a student to a certain degree, and certainly in teaching here. It goes back quite a ways, and there are many thanks to this one. I'm not going to do quite as many as I have before, but I want to single out a couple of people. Eric is actually the third director to have been involved at the school, leading the school while I worked on this book. Michael Rotundi was kind enough to give me my first teaching job here with Mike Davis when we visited a whole lot of prisons and jails. And Neil Denari hired me a second time a few years later and let me do quite a bit of the work to do with museums. And then Eric has been wonderfully supportive ever since, as have all the history theory folk and my friends who teach studio. But I want to single out Hernan. Hernan Diaz-Alonso has been, for me, a really sustaining and ongoing conversation through these years on this book and on other projects, and frankly, and maybe most importantly, how this book could, after all this time and with so many other tangents in my kind of design interests, how to pull this book into frame and into a kind of pertinence for what we're interested now in my design studio with Yo Oshima and Taya Watanabe and a few others that I think find their way onto a slide here. So I want to thank Hernan and Ming if she's around. But with that said, what Eric and I had talked about, and I'll tell you where this starts for me. When we did Blow by Blow, the installation in the SCI-Arc gallery, it was principally about new possibilities for cinematic space. And to be honest, that is, in many respects, a kind of driving interest of my studio now. But for a decade before that, I had been teaching quite a bit around two typologies that I hoped could be related to cinema, but that weren't necessarily so. My first teaching job here, as I said, was with Mike Davis, and it was a survey of the California prison system. We went to about 20 facilities, and I spent quite a few years just trying to imagine how that work could filter into anything else. Prisons are a remarkably obdurate building type in a whole lot of different ways. But when we did our Blow by Blow, we installed a whole bunch of relief models that were kind of they were paired relief plans of prisons and museums at a common scale to kind of see how these buildings could or couldn't relate to one another. I've left these images cycling. You'll see an early one that shows the Panopticon and the Guggenheim. This one that's up right now is a comparison of Pelican Bay State Prison and the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, at a common scale. We had, I think, 10 of these pairs that started to look at how these two building types at a common scale or at a set of common concerns started to relate to one another. Eric was kind enough to take a careful look at that installation and was ready to talk about it when, the night of our gallery talk, we changed all the projection and had it relate instead to film. And so with that, I was sort of hoping we could pick up where I didn't kind of let us carry on there and talk a bit about the book. Just to maybe lead off a little bit, because I know when I turn things over, it's over. I would say this about the book. I think the book is, Corrections and Collections is nominally about two building types over 50 years and how they've played out in a contemporary context, how to a certain degree I think they index some profound issues in our field over that post-war period. The way I would explain it most briefly is to say it's a book about vision and transgression. I got fascinated by prisons and museums at roughly the same time for similar reasons. They're both buildings that have a lot to do with how you choreograph vision, who's allowed to see what and when and for what reasons, how these buildings stage those kinds of transitions and relationships, how they enforce them. And I think in that respect, if in no other, prisons and museums have quite a bit in common. What they've also had in common in the last 30 or 40 years, but not necessarily historically, is a monstrous role in urban renewal. Prisons and museums, and in particular museums of contemporary art and new metropolitan jails, have played a disproportionate role in how America has rebuilt its inner cities over the last 30, 40 years. And it was actually this argument that I think made it a book that Routledge could get excited about and take out into the world. And it was that thesis that really preoccupied me for a lot of the last 10 years, figuring out how those buildings did that, why they did it, how they did it in different ways through a series of periods. And a lot of the book is about how minimalism and post-minimalism, as I'll term them, and Eric will call me to account on that, millennial and post-millennial institutions each reshaped American and then kind of global urban space and actually rural space in unforeseen ways. And I think through architectural innovations that change in each of those periods in profound ways. After a convergence in a kind of minimalist, stark, we'll talk about what's, and maybe at that point I'll open it up. But.
Let me just, wow. Let me ask, how many people in the room read the book? So a fair number. So the first response to that is for the people who haven't, so read it yourself, because I think probably what you're going to hear, at least in this context, wouldn't or shouldn't preclude you drawing your own conclusion and making your own interpretation about what this actually means. It may be a sign that all of us, certainly myself, have hung around this place too long, because I think one of the difficulties over a period of time is that the idea that these discussions involve, in a certain austere sense, you have no friends, you have no enemies, and really the purpose of these discussions is to be helpful to you people, to the students, to the faculty, getting at the content of the architecture discourse, who says what, why they say it, and whether or not you should listen, and how you draw your own conclusions. There is, so whether that means we're too friendly or not, I guess we'll find out. But the subtitle for the book is Architecture's Plural for Art and Crime. And one of the fundamental questions is, what relationship does the museum have to art and the prison have to crime? So I think there's a question about what is the subject for the book, and more than that, is the book a news piece in the old-fashioned sense that news used to be about what happened empirically, to the extent that it's possible to determine that, or, and more so, it's about an editorial perspective, which is a comment on what's happening, which leads to the conclusion, if there's a conceit in our society between the architecture of museums and the architecture of prisons, so what? Is that good? Is that bad? Is it an irony that what one would assume, at least superficially, belongs to the content of museums, which in a sense, in theory, ought to be very different than what you would think instinctively is the mission of a jail? They're very different. So somebody comes along and says, wait a minute, they're not so different, they're actually similar. So is that a comment on the fact that we've gone in the wrong direction or we should fix it? Or is that a comment on the fact that we don't know what art is or what crime is? So what actually is the meaning of the conflation of those two building types? What's the meaning of that?
Well, I think historically it would be hard to make a rhyme between them. I think historically museums and prisons were very, very different buildings, maybe polar opposites in certain respects. In medieval times, You had, you had the prince in his castle with his art that would someday become a museum, and you had the outer ramparts of the city into which would be wedged prison space in the gates. Newgate, most of the kind of medieval prisons that we've heard of are named for the gates they were wedged into, the outer infrastructure of cities. And they were very different buildings built for very, very different parts of society. I think what we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years, and this to me is sort of the crux of my book, is that the questions of transgression have actually been defined to an almost infinitesimal degree. And societal transgressions, where people do what we deem incarceratable, have actually been defined into an incredibly subtle range of offenses. Many of them in our country, I should point out, this is a story that can really only be told from the United States. We incarcerate more people than any nation on earth, 6 times more per capita than China, 10 and 12 times as many per capita as Europe. And I know the statistics aren't necessarily that critical, but we have over 2 million people behind bars, which is about the same number that visit our museums each day. And transgression, societal transgression, has been defined into this incredible calculus of I think, social modulation. It has a lot to do with what we do with a labor force that is larger than our demand for it at the moment, sadly. I think on the other side of it, and this really is where you start, Eric, with the question of art, I actually do think quite a bit of contemporary art can be defined relatively clearly in terms of its cultural transgressions. How it establishes a set of cultural expectations or norms or sets of actual kind of possibilities within the field of art, and those transgressions don't have to necessarily resemble breaking the law, but the way you surpass expectations within the arts, how you surpass those boundaries, is how you qualify for museological attention. So we've built these buildings to really suit societal and cultural transgressions, and I think the architecture is kind of echo that increasing clarity, actually.
But when you, if your interest is in moving the discussion in art and architecture, is it your contention that that takes place because the architect or the artist sets out to change the frame of reference of the discussion, which would mean evaluating what's around you or one, seeing what it left out, or seeing what it should have been, and then trying to go there, which makes it a much more extroverted discussion, really, that it's a response to what's outside of you, or is what really changes things a more introverted response, which has, in a sense, not much cognizance of what's around. I don't care, but I'll look at it in my own way. And if somebody wants to say at some point it changed the discussion, okay. And if they want to say something else, okay. But the discourse belongs to me in a personal way rather than a responsive to an external condition way.
I think my model is elastic enough to kind of take up either of those poles, and it's definitely the case. As there's an image here that we'll cycle through that includes 300 museums. I think a couple of Eric's proposals included amongst them 300 museums built or proposed in the last 30 years. And I actually think within those 300, you see that entire spectrum of possibility. You see architects who are looking at the world, trying to formulate clear, often kind of diagrammatic responses to it. You see, actually going back a little further, architects that were interested in questions of representation, how we can represent the history of our field or the new technologies driving it. And I think you do see, actually, in quite a few incredibly prolific architects, a much more private, internalized set of questions being asked about how to surpass their own expectations for what environments of art and, frankly, what architectural space more generally can become. So I think your point is what establishes the range of possibilities, exactly. But
when you look at what it takes societally in terms of funds, in terms of metropolitan commitments to do these big projects, these big museum projects, isn't it possible that the museums are the end of the discussion and they're really the residual consequences of what really was the original work, which was likely to be more speculative and smaller and more fragile, less durable, and that when everybody gets together and says, let's do this, and we all agree, it's hard to countenance that anymore as opposition or transgression because everybody is agreeing. So where is the transgression when everybody agrees and supports these projects on a big scale in a particular language, which I think somebody or other who supports it or donates to it or civically gets behind it has said, this is okay. In one of your phrases, and I remember Philip talking like this, the architect is a bankable architect. So if you're a bankable architect, is that work and the production still in the category of a transgression?
I think that's a fair question. I mean, I think most of the time, most museum design is at best a kind of institutionalized radicality. But I think that said, the degree to which museums do represent an incredible kind of convergence of capital and often, a remarkable set of forces, often not terribly flattering to the way we organize our civilization. I actually do think that as within our field, if you look at major gambles on new spatial paradigms, and I would agree, frankly, that not only galleries, but schools, the artist studios themselves are often the sites of much more radical work, much more, certainly the first iterations of the kind of radicality that may or may not echo its way into museums. I do think that within a broader societal frame, museums are often where the most groundbreaking ideas in our field are tried to the greatest kind of effect, or
at a bigger scale,
to the broadest audience. I don't disagree with you, but I don't think it's a. I don't disagree with you, but I don't think it's a. I don't think even within those bounds it's a negligible project. I think, frankly, museums are kind of the high game of our field.
I think what I'm saying is that if you have a constituency, and I think this is a paradox and a question which is asked over and over, would you rather be hated or be loved? And so this is not such an easy one to answer, but if there's a huge constituency that supports a particular piece of work, and that's what it takes to build these big projects, then again, where's the opposition? Where's the transgression? You're already confirming a societal. In other words, they've defanged the monster, and this is one of the ways that it's done, actually, by saying you're not outside. And I think America and Europe are pretty good at that. That what is outside the game can be brought internal to the game, and it changes the game. And then the question is, did the person on the edge come to the center, or the person in the center come to the edge? And so we have to answer that.
I think museums are unique for being able to ask that center to edge question simultaneously in a big building. Actually, as big buildings go, museums require a lot less consensus than most. I mean, a lot of enormous museums are built by single benefactors who have more or less built whatever they wanted to. And you can argue the way patronage works, the degree to which that is or isn't an actual architectural expression, I think is really up for debate. But frankly, in terms of elective structures, and even that's Coop's project in Akron, I mean, that had some state funding. But odds are they awarded it to Coop, and Coop came back, Wolf came back with what he thought they needed floating over that city. It's pretty remarkable. One of the astounding things I think about looking at museums over the last 30 years is how many times people have done truly outlandish things and gotten away with it.
It raises the question: is a 100-foot cantilever more important than a 20-foot cantilever at this point in time? Fair enough. I mean, it raises that question, and I think there probably was a point in time when the answer was, yeah. At this point in time, I'm not so sure. Another way to look at it is you look at this stuff, and the question is, does it surprise you do you find something that you didn't anticipate? Do you learn something you didn't know? And I'm not so sure. I mean, Bilbao for sure. I remember actually going to the opening. This is just anecdotal, but going to the opening of that thing and walking down the stair into that thing and bumping into Wolf, Helmut, and Nouvelle, drunk as hell, sitting on the stair, staring up at the building, basically saying, "What the fuck is left for us to do?" Sorry, you guys. But, you know, and literally saying that. In other words, you now subsumed, Frank, almost every gesticulation that's plausible. And these guys were soused. I remember just sitting down on that step I came last and just looking at that. Meaning that what is I think, genuinely so of Bilbao. And don't forget, I mean, Bilbao was drawn. Remember the guy who did the working drawings for that thing going around the city looking for a job? You know, Frank dumped him, and we were going around looking for a job. He's nobody to hire him because nobody was doing that. And this was just in the era where there's a transition from the more conventional, which made it the more interesting, actually, because the capacity to implement it at a technical level, to draw it and to represent it, is very different now. And if somebody came along and did Bilbao today, it would have a completely different meaning. So it's not only that he imagined it, but he produced it and he implemented it. That discussion is very different now too, because the capacity to implement very many different things is a completely different prospect now. When you do it, makes a big difference.
I think that's really true. And Bilbao did a lot of things first. I mean, Bilbao on kind of a practical level is one of the best cases in support of more museums, because they figured out so many things on that however long he was unemployed, he's definitely got a job now. But Bilbao actually, when you asked about what I learned in doing this, Bilbao actually gets at one of the fundamental lessons or kind of questions I left this book with, and it is the relationship between art and architecture, between artists and architects. The confusion of Frank Gehry with an artist and with the artists of his generation is an incredibly controversial side of that story. But before getting anywhere near that, Bilbao does something really clever that a number of buildings before Bilbao didn't. The Guggenheim and the Wexner Center by Peter Eisenman, both Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim, both of those buildings were protested by artists before they opened. And Frank Gehry did something really smart in Bilbao. He created a space that was, epic and no word for it, but architectural, that worked in tandem with Richard Serra's sculpture. But he also included a whole kind of pinwheel of normative galleries, and he undercut the basic critique that artists bring to bear against architects of building buildings that compete with or undermine or, frankly, undo their work and their role as cultural producers, or however you want to phrase it. And I think Gehry and a number of other, and frankly the Wexner Center and its evolution, and the Guggenheim, these buildings that were initially understood to be hostile to art have over time, and in almost every case, proven to be kind of catalysts for new art and have ended up kind of redeeming themselves.
Well, there are a couple of questions that have to do with doing museums in a building program. I mean, it's I think pretty clear that art can be almost anything, and the space can be almost anything. So the constraints programmatically on the configuration of the building are minimal. So that's one issue in terms of making. The other one, which is, as we've said before, the Louvre used to be somebody's house. The Guggenheim started out as a garage. Your Panopticon was a factory. So if we want to conflate, I mean, shouldn't we be talking about factories and garages rather than museums and jails?
Maybe so, and this is a conversation I've had with Todd in a few different ways. The whole question of whether my kind of focus and bracketing of these two building types really holds up. I can tell you my fascination with the two of them and with cinema really derives from just how visually preoccupied they are, how much these are buildings that are designed primarily around the orchestration of how people see, what they're allowed to see, for what reasons. And on those grounds, I would argue they're not totally and fundamentally apart from all other buildings, but I think they prioritize that question in a categorically different way. So
you mean what you see as a building, or what you see as the contents of the building?
Both.
But as you point out, most of these buildings have no esoteric contents anyway. So you're speculating on what's going to, some do, but a lot of these are museums without any collection, without any program.
True, and well, the challenge of the challenge of a museum that actually doesn't have a collection to brag about is another kind of challenge of the last 50 years. We didn't build buildings without an excuse for art before that, and it's a European import. The idea of the Kunsthalle, where you trade out whatever you've got and show something different and try to pull people in to see the new. That's new to the U.S. and actually a really groundbreaking. You're probably going to read a lot of sad stories about MoCA over the next year or two. MoCA's got a lot of issues, but whatever problems it has, it's been an incredibly groundbreaking museum in the United States for establishing that idea of a Kunsthalle model, just bringing curators together, letting them curate across genres and mediums, and bring in whatever they think might be interesting to talk about.
One of the questions in that regard is whether the topics that those museums make available to the general public are intelligible or meaningful, or whether the language that in which museums speak and the programs that they produce actually have a very tiny constituency. It's a small group talking to another small group. And in that small group comes the discourse that we were talking about in the hallway, which is late modern, deconstruction, postmodern, minimal, all of that kind of stuff. All of that nomenclature, which at least some people is foreign to most people. I think if you're a serious architect, it's certainly debatable. And yet in the context of that group of people producing these shows and routinely discussing them, those categories are assumed to be legitimate ways of thinking and understanding and categorizing, as if work is defined by the label, as opposed to the label usually being inadequate or insufficient to define the work. It's at least an interesting question. One is the plausibility of labels, and two, who's listening?
And who gets to make those labels and why they're formulated. I think this, Eric, is something on which you and I feel like we have a friendly and productive disagreement, because I spend a lot of time thrashing around in those terms and imagining that they have a kind of validity and a utility to them. And I thought about it after our discussion in the hallway, and I would actually say that discussions in hallways are the way most of those terms get invented in the first place. But I think, I think
but
terms
they ought
like,
to stay in the hallway. They don't.
Well, this is, I think there is a little bit of a question of where you are entering your field. I think in the first decade or two of a life in the arts, you want to know what to call things, you want to know what they are, you want to have a command of the language around your art to a certain degree. And I think most people, when they reach a certain degree of maturity in terms of what they do, are no longer comfortable being kind of reined in by those terms, and certainly don't like it when terms are invented after the fact to describe what they do. I mean, I think you're concerned. I feel like your take on terminology like that is so close to, say, someone like Donald Judd, who would punch someone out for calling him a minimalist. And yet, frankly, that's a piece by Donald Judd. These are all pieces by Donald Judd that I feel pretty comfortable talking about under that rubric.
But wait a minute. But it's not only the image, which might lead you to the conclusion that you just arrived at. It's the content, or what drives it, or what meanings you're pursuing. And I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, there's a slide that I've used a few times of Broadway Boogie Woogie, which I shot in your friends Cy and Victoria's apartment, which was hanging on the wall, and the tape was falling off. And so this is an essential, if you wanted to begin to understand the terminology of them, we're just picking on one term, minimal. So you hear that. What does minimal mean? And if you looked at a print, a Mondrian print, you could see this distillation of the world down to what? Down to right angles, straight lines, red, blue, yellow, as in a sense saying, maybe this is like Plato's cave, which makes it a kind of old story, that what is essential is not all the pieces that are happenstance, that under the pieces that are happenstance is an austere, dependable structure. And if you make a painting like that and it's 1925, and I don't know who you're reacting against, maybe McKim, Mead and White, or maybe Seurat and Monet, I don't know, but you have an opposition. So the proposition that Mondrian would come in and say, there's this essence, don't give me all the frivolities, don't give me the specifics, there's an essential structure underneath that. Okay, so that's one issue. It means something at a particular time. Now, when Ando goes and makes a blockhouse 100 years later, so this is a really different discussion. This is a stylistic choice that belongs to a discussion in Dwell magazine. I pick this, you pick that. But as an oppositional choice, which is original, it's certainly not original to him at all. So this is one issue. In other words, when it's done. But the other one is that in the book we were talking about, there's this picture of Broadway Boogie Woogie as a print. And when you print it, all the lines are at right angles and all the colors are right. And then you look at a blow up of a corner of the painting, and when you actually look at the painting, you can see the brush strokes, you can see the lines aren't straight. So to be intellectually honest, even minimal in its essence, at its origin, wasn't minimal. Which is just interesting. It's interesting. Now maybe the origin, you can, I know the answer to that, but I think these are the questions that have to do with the meanings of these terms. You don't just get to be a minimalist because somebody says pick one. You can be postmodern, you can be late modern, you can be deconstruction, you can be digital something. You know, pick one. It doesn't really work like that when you're doing architecture. You don't get to do that. Then it's a fashion discussion, and I think at that point those categories may be useful in bracketing work in terms of strategies, and then all of that work really I think is past the point of original thinking, belongs to a second group of production, which may be better or not so good.
I agree that clarity, purity, austerity, these are, among many others, values that recur throughout the history of art in 101 ways. And there's a lot of interesting work right now. I don't know if Andrew and Anna are really interested in Malevich's monochromes, so the white square, and precisely in the way you're bringing it up, they want to look at what's going on the canvas next to that white and how white becomes white. These are issues that persist, fruitful. Thank God they do. I don't disagree with you, but I do think some terms are more useful than others in certain times. And in the 60s and 70s, minimalism became an oddly shared preoccupation amongst artists and architects. So you had architects really for the first time in quite a while wanting to produce buildings that resembled sculpture, that resembled the sculpture of their contemporaries in the art world. And when the Hirshhorn, for example, was built, and you see this incredibly austere, clear, cylindrical building with no windows, the architecture critics of the time went ballistic. They thought it was a disaster. Otto Louise Huxtable called it neo-penitential. And she felt that importing the values of contemporary sculpture into architecture was creating a catastrophic architecture. And whether the multiplication of that particular sensibility through cities was a good or a bad thing, or just an interesting thing, it made our public buildings resemble, it made various kinds of institutions resemble one another more than they ever had before. So on that level, it's at that level that I think the term has some utility. And I would say the same for the other three. Post-minimalism and the way minimalism is critiqued in the art world, I think finds an interesting echo in our field. The way, in the art world, basically, critics started saying, we aren't talking about how people are relating to objects and space. We're just repeating objects. And if you're going to pull people into this equation, you have to think about it differently. And I think a lot of the buildings we made in the 70s and 80s for both prisons and museums. And I have to say, actually, this is a hugely gratifying conversation for me because it's the first one that it's been 90% architecture for art, not crime. Most of the time, I'm talking a lot about prisons. But that in the 80s, you saw a real
problem
shift.
is there are not enough architects who are real criminals. That's the problem. I mean, if you want to conflate the two, then what's a criminal?
There have been some locked up. I mean, Piranesi did a little time.
By the way, and by the way, what is a criminal to do with a jail?
Frank Lloyd Wright did time. Frank Lloyd Wright both did time and designed jail cells in Marin.
In thinking about the museum jail conceit, it occurred to me, and this is just a hypothesis, are there others that we left out of this? In other words, could you make corporate office buildings and jails? Could you make hospitals and jails? In some ways, the spirit of those typologies in organizing relatively small events that work repetitively are quite different, actually, than the museum, which is, I would argue, programless at this point. You want to make a museum, go make it. You want to make a hospital? Maybe not. You want to make I think corporate offices in jails would be an interesting kind of parallel.
I think there's a fair case to be made that there are a lot of buildings that on the level of organizational planning are closer to prisons than museums. And I would actually say the same of museums. Arguably, stadiums, even airport terminals, are more like most museums than prisons are in terms of how space is segregated and repeated, perhaps. But I think actually in terms of how we build institutions in our cities, these two buildings play a surprisingly complementary role, and some of that has to do with their scale and their workings as architecture, and a lot of it has to do with what we felt we needed in our cities. Museums, we all kind of get the Bilbao effect, or before that the Pompidou effect, or to a lesser degree the Guggenheim effect, and how museums shore up urban space, how they create.
Maybe they should have stopped after that.
Yeah, I don't know how many more effects there can be, but jails do something strangely similar with really under the radar. Basically, we created these incredibly diversified drug laws in particular, many different kinds of transgressions that send you away for far, far longer into these enormous internodal networks that cover our states and our country. And in order to ship people out into them, we needed new urban centers to pull people, to actually start people in that process. What we didn't realize as we started building these urban jails was just how many people would fight having them in our cities and what kinds of architectural gymnastics we'd have to perform to get them to happen. And so in the 70s and 80s, and I think this is one of the more kind of compelling architectural sides to that side of my story, you really do see a series of stealth buildings, prisons and museums that are built to resemble exactly the buildings you just described, hospitals and office towers, that the federal government came in and decreed in a number of American cities in order to get new correctional space into those cities. And the cover of Mike Davis's City of Courts is a picture of our Metropolitan Detention Center a couple blocks over. That holds 800 inmates, and that was considered by Ellerby Beckett, considered something of an architectural success in its anonymity. But that 800 bed building meant that the county could build an 8,000 bed facility on the other side of the train tracks.
But I mean, this is the way contemporary cities are made. And you can actually see this taking place in one swoop in China, for instance. But isn't that a different discussion than the relationship of art and artistic content to building, and jails and jailhouse content to jails, and the two to one another, as opposed to saying, for instance, this is the way we make contemporary cities? Because I think there's a pretty consistent example of the vacuousness of the conception of contemporary urbanism that relates everything to commerce and to buying. And one of the useful comments about Peter Eisenman's project across from Frank's project near the Brandenburg Gate, the Jewish project, whatever you think about an effort to memorialize that event, which is really probably impossible to do, it's in the center of a city. It's enormously popular and inhabited by all ages. And it doesn't have one Zegna, Prada, yogurt stand, Gucci, or anything. And this is also an interesting, it's an anomaly maybe, and sure as hell Eisenman had no idea, and to be honest, wasn't interested. I think when he came to speak at graduation a few years ago, we talked a little bit about that the consequences of the project in a sociological way had nothing to do with the nominal consequences in terms of the programmatic assignment. And so I think the discussion of how to make cities or what we put in them is a different discussion. And I think you can't have both of these. And I think that different discussions, if you're saying making cities now in downtown areas utilizes prisons for jobs, for business, for scale, and so on, and there are funds available for that. And likewise, make museums, because to be cultured is to be important as a civic entity, and you have to do that. But that's different, actually, from the proposition that we're conflating the two uses, and we don't know the difference between a jail and a museum. Do we know the difference?
I think we know. I think we know the difference, and we sometimes have some fun confusing the differences or lapse into confusing them. But I think actually, Eric, I do think, I think this is a success story for our discipline. I actually think these are two building types that witnessed major innovations in their basic architectural logic. And those successes led to them being kind of urbanistically viable in unforeseen ways. So while I don't think urbanism has caused better architecture, I actually suspect better architecture may have led to certain varieties of urbanism. I think the way these, I didn't quite finish my point on the jails. The crazy thing, the problem with jails, frankly, is that everybody but the inmates can leave. So every new jail, every new bed you add these economies. You add everyone representing them in court, everyone overseeing them in those facilities, and they've shored up. Little Tokyo has all the restaurants it does because they've survived since the 80s because of jurors. That midweek economy is huge, and
Is that good?
I think it's.
Is that so?
I think it is so, and I think yes. Actually, sadly, I believe in cities. I believe in the degree to which America's cities, and especially their core urban areas, are, I think, in demonstratively better shape than they were in 1975 by 2005. I do think that's a good thing. I mean, it's frustrating not to be able to park, but I do think these are basically positive. I think their urbanistic effects are positive. The question is at what cost, and the cost for the people embroiled in those in both those systems is profound. I mean, but especially the correctional one. I think we've talked a bit about art and the degree to which people kind of produce art for museums and maybe impoverish their life pursuits by getting overcommitted to the kind of rhetoric of art. I mean, that's sad, but it's truly, absolutely tragic what becomes of a lot of the lives that have scaled up our correctional system. And but maybe to end on or maybe to kind of turn that on a happier note, one of the things I try to cover late in the book is how these two logics have become interrelated, how they've overlapped or collided with one another. And I have to say, I mean, part of the reason this is a little more ad hoc and maybe run a little longer than it should have is I've gotten totally hooked on Orange is the New Black. There's actually, it's sort of incredible to me the degree to which the logic of both has started to kind of take over the other. We're making a lot of art around correctional environments, and sadly, there's an incredible amount of crime being directed at our curatorial environments. The heist in Rem Koolhaas's Kunsthal, they got in 2 minutes over €200 worth of art in 2 minutes, and that was supposed to be a kind of panoptically impregnable museum. Those, I mean, they're ironies, but I think they are ironies that engage our field in compelling ways.
Well, let me ask you, there's a couple more things. How, you're talking about cities, and now we're on making cities. How durable, how enduring is the what you're calling the contemporary role of a museum and a jail in downtown? Where's that going to be in 50 years, 100 years?
I don't.
In other words, I mean, it's a worthwhile question. If you want to argue that makes a city, and the durability of a city is, or the ability of a city to make itself, to reimagine itself, to keep itself alive. Otherwise, in a certain caricature sense, Venice would be the other alternative. In other words, it has pieces that are anachronistic, but they still draw people to come and see what it used to be, as opposed to something which is contemporary and is durably contemporary.
I don't know if our museums will become the kind of continuous cultural archipelago that is all of continental Europe at this point. I don't know if our museums will kind of sharpen in that way. I think, frankly, the correctional environments we've built, I'm hoping many of them become anachronistic and unnecessary sooner rather than later. We've incarcerated far too, it's insane, the kind of political dynamics that have led us to put away as many people as we have. But I think they did trigger a 25-year run of urban renewal that involved, in the wake of those museums and prisons, new sports centers, new hotels, frankly, the downtown that most of you guys live in, I really think is inaugurated by this odd doubling in defunct civic space that seemed to pick things up. I think the plans you're making for the LA River, frankly, I hope, I'm confident that moves like that are going to be of more enduring relevance. I think they will grow into what they can become in a more benign way, but they're going to engage in this. Christopher Hawthorne, who I know is a dangerous name to drop into this place in any respect.
He's teaching here next semester.
Good.
Do you know that?
Christopher's great.
So everybody should please sign up.
Christopher.
By his, I know you guys are pals, but he asked me to, he's making a guidebook on LA. Therefore, he claims not to know what a guidebook on LA is. So guess what he's going to do? He's going to come to SCI-Arc, and that's where he's going to find out.
Wow. Well,
so we'll see.
We'll see what landmarks. We'll see what landmarks.
How many jails and museums?
He made a really smart observation about the jail, our big Twin Towers complex. It's the largest correctional facility in the free world on the north end of Union Station. And what I didn't realize about it was that it banks onto the LA River. when the LA River becomes the public space we all imagine it could be, that all of a sudden is going to become unbelievably prime real estate. And those kinds, for what it's worth historically, many jails have become museums for exactly that reason. They've been reinvented into something else, but I hope many more of them are. I feel like, Eric, I wonder if we should.
You done?
I wonder if we
I wanted to ask you the final question, which is, you cited the museum, Malraux's discussion of the museum without walls. And the question which it suggests is that art dislocated from its connection to life in an everyday sense is a mistake. Meaning, in a very primitive, I don't think you got into this, I didn't find it, but Altamira, Lescaut, those kinds of things where art is built into a context where you make things on the wall because the things you put on the wall explain your life to you, which in a certain sense, I would argue art needs to be, and in a contemporary sense, almost never is. And the question is whether we've made a fundamental mistake not putting that stuff. I mean, we tried, and we did a lousy job, to be honest, with Lebbeus Woods' project, which is too small. It didn't work, but anyway, the idea was, I think, the right idea to integrate, aside from the fact that everybody walks by and nobody knows what the hell it is, which is, or many people don't, which is also part of what I'm saying. In other words, whether the museum's in the wrong place and ought to be out on the street with the criminals. So that's the last question.
I feel like that's a good rhetorical, good retaurical way to end. I mean, museums are historically, when you go in, museums get accused of a lot. I mean, museums were the way the Western world colonized the rest or colonized itself. All of the treasures of Italian churches and Greek ruins have been shipped to every kind of every empire that's developed enough strength to steal them from the last one. I had a student last week who presented they presented Bernard Shumi's museum under the Acropolis. And I bring it up because it's a pretty interesting example of a museum built with a consciousness about exactly that issue of kind of cultural thievery and what you do there. I mean, it was built in an understanding that the Greeks needed to build a museum that made enough sense to bring back some of the antiquities that British and French museums were claiming weren't safe in their home countries. So there's a mundane security issue, but more than that, and I think it really was a driver for Shumi's scheme, I think it's a brilliant museum, and I think it's a brilliant museum because the challenge of repatriating the patrimony of that country to occupy his museum set a bar incredibly high for how it was going to relate to that work and to the Parthenon and to architecture.
So, I mean, there's another point to this, which is big-time art in the world is about big-time stealing. I mean, the Elgin marbles are in a British museum. They're not in Bernard's project. They're in England.
That's where lawyers trump architects.
So let me just to wind it up. I recommend that you buy the book. I don't think buy it and read it and come to your own conclusions. As I said at the beginning, not our conclusions. It's a very intricate, genuinely esoteric effort to develop contradictory arguments with multiple sources and multiple vantage points. It's really a sophisticated, unusual piece of work, and I think it's you don't see this too much, but there's something essentially original about it, extremely original, because the proposition that he rolls out is not a conventional proposition. I'm not sure in the end that what we should do with it, meaning it's, as I said at the beginning, it's an editorial comment or it's a newsmaker's comment, but I think it's a really remarkable book, special book, and definitely recommend it to you, and I want to thank Joe for bringing it here and sharing it with you, and pick it up. Thank you.
Eric, thank you very much. I'm told there are some copies of this, and students get it for it's. And I apologize for this. It's an expensive paperback from my point of view, maybe from any point of view, but it is $29 for students. I think $31 for faculty, probably anyone else, and we've got a few. And whether or not, well, I have that enormous table of 300 architects about which I'm happy to argue with anyone that will go out with any copies tonight.
You know the Berkeley guy who had the title page of the book, "Steal This Book"?
Yeah.
So
yeah, this might be the one.
Expensive, you can
just lift it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then get an even more intimate knowledge. Thank you.